Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Imagine discovering a lost document from a prominent historical figure. Now that may sound like something out of an Indiana Jones or National Treasure narrative, but something like that has apparently happened, and Nicolas Cage did not discover it. This is the recovery of a manuscript containing sermons from St. Augustine. We're going to be joined by Jimmy Akin to talk about this. Jimmy is an internationally known author and speaker, senior apologist at Catholic Answers, more than 30 years of experience defending and explaining the faith. He's a convert to the faith and has an extensive background in Bible, theology, church fathers, philosophy, canon law, and liturgy. He's also a weekly guest on the national radio program Catholic Answers Live, regular contributor to Catholic Answers magazine, popular blogger, and podcaster. His personal website is jimmyakin.com. Jimmy, great to speak with you. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing just fine. Very pleased to be here.
Well, very glad to connect with you to talk about the writings of someone whom you and I mutually love, and that's St. Augustine of Hippo. So let's talk now. We're certain that Harrison Ford and Nicolas Cage had nothing to do with the discovery.
I'm pretty sure of that. Yeah, I would say so.
So tell us about what we've discovered here.
Well, basically, a couple, 3 years ago, a professor over in Europe was contacted by a monastic association, and he was a Latinist, and he was asked to look at a manuscript that is at a monastery library in Poland. And when he looked at the manuscript, he found that it contained 6 sermons by St. Augustine, and 4 of them were not too special because they were already known. They were already sermons that we had copies of. But 2 of the sermons were previously unknown. Now, St. Augustine, like a lot of authors in the ancient world, in fact, basically all of the authors in the ancient world, wrote more than we have today because it was very difficult before the introduction of the printing press in the 1400s to make large numbers of copies of a work. Every copy had to be handmade, and people don't realize this, but they had to hand make the paper that the copies were written on. They didn't have paper mills the way we do today, so they either had to weave together papyrus reeds, or they had to grow and skin an animal and, scrape all the hair off in order to get parchment. And so it was very difficult to make copies. And as a result, not many copies were made. So a lot of authors in the ancient world wrote a lot of different things, but only a few of them got copied enough that we still have copies today. And that applies to St. Augustine, just like other ancient authors. He wrote more than we have. And so this new discovery in this manuscript of these 2 new sermons is a treasure for us today because it gives us a little bit more that St. Augustine wrote.
And thereby, just simply based on that reality, a greater appreciation for his heritage. But you also point out that there might have been some reason to suspect the authenticity of the manuscripts. Share with us what happened and the inquiry that took place.
Yeah, so one of the things that scholars do when they look at ancient manuscripts is they try to figure out, was this written by the person we think it was written by? And sometimes the answer to that is no. Sometimes a work will be regarded as by one author, and it turns out it's written by someone else. A famous example of that is in the book of Acts, in Acts 17, when St. Paul speaks in Athens. He speaks at a place called the Areopagus, which was kind of a discussion club that they had in ancient Athens. And it mentions that one of the people who converted was a guy named Dionysius, or to give the English version of the name, Dennis. And in the early church, somebody wrote in the name of Dionysius the Areopagite, and he wrote this very famous work of mystical theology, and it was very popular. and it was for a long time regarded as being by Dionysius the Areopagite from Acts 17. But later it was discovered that it was actually not by him. And that kind of thing tends to happen when we, sometimes at least, when we look at ancient documents. There are others like St. Ambrose, for example. There are some manuscripts that people thought were by St. Ambrose, and it turns out they weren't. And so now people will say, well, they're written by the Ambrosiaster instead of by St. Ambrose himself. And so you've always got to be on the lookout for, is this really by who we think it is? And and they use different clues, scholars do, to try to figure that out. One of the clues in this case was the manuscript that contains the sermons was written in the 12th century. And there are various ways to tell that by, for example, the handwriting. And that was a little unusual because we wouldn't expect a copy to be made like this in the 12th century. It would have been more common for this kind of thing to be copied in the 8th or the 9th century. So there was a question of, is this really by Augustine or not? And so what the professor did, Christian Tornow, he got colleagues involved, other experts. And last summer, he had a summer school on this that over 20 Latinists participated in. And they looked at all the data, and they made their individual assessments of, is it really by Augustine or not? And they concluded unanimously, yes, these sermons are by St. Augustine. They fit the way he writes, everything else we know about him other than the timing when they were copied. It all fits St. Augustine. And so we have, at least at the scholarly level, a pretty high confidence that they are genuine. And as a result of that, there's going to be a critical edition of them published later this year.
And many of us are looking forward to the publication of this work. Can you talk about how, when the conclusion was made unanimous that the sermons were in fact genuine, there was a kind of eruption of excitement, because this is a further addition to what is already a magnificent corpus, not just in the church's repertoire, but also in Augustine's contributions.
Yes, it is something that is exciting, and one of the things that's exciting about it is the text that Augustine is preaching about in these sermons, because it happens to be one of the more mysterious passages in the Old Testament. And it's a text that Augustine dealt with a few times, but this is new data that gives us more information about what St. Augustine thought about this passage.
So you highlight a few things about the narrative in 1 Samuel 28 and how that plays out in the way this text was verified as Augustine's writings. I wonder if you could share that with us.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. So you highlight specifically how 1 Samuel 28 was dealt with in the sermons, right? Could you please share that with us and how that lent to the credence?
Yeah, so I can tell you what we know about the passage, and then what St. Augustine elsewhere said about it. So 1 Samuel 28 is the famous story about King Saul and the so-called witch of Endor. Now, just for people who may not remember it off the top of their heads, King Saul, this is at the end of his career as king, and he is...
We're going to pause there. We're talking with Jimmy Akin, internationally known author and speaker, senior apologist at Catholic Answers. We're talking about a recent breakthrough discovery of a few new sermons by St. Augustine that were, again, recently discovered, and now a critical edition is being published. We're going to continue on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm talking with Jimmy Akin, author and speaker, senior apologist at Catholic Answers. More than 30 years of experience defending and explaining the faith. Jimmy, we were talking earlier about these newly discovered sermons of St. Augustine, and we've talked about how there are certain parallels in the writing style that correspond to what we know about Augustine's writing style and how they were unanimously determined as his original works. But there are a few, or at least one thing that you highlight that is rather unique, and that has to do with Saul's potential salvation in the sermon. Can you please share with us? So we're still talking about the 1 Samuel 28 narrative.
Yeah, so we need to make sure folks remember this narrative. Now, it's at the end of Saul's career as king, and he's on the outs with God, and he's really terrified because there's a Philistine army that he's going to have to do battle with, and he wants to know what he needs to do. So he tries consulting God, but in multiple different ways, but God is not picking up the phone. So he decides, even though he's previously cast all of the mediums out of Israel or forbidden them to contact spirits for people, he gets his men to hunt him up a medium, and he calls up the soul, the ghost, of the dead prophet Samuel, who he had known in life, and says, "What should I do?" And Samuel says, "Well, I'm afraid I can't help you out, and in fact, you're about to die." And indeed, he ends up being killed by the Philistines. So it didn't work out too well for Saul, and this passage has been widely debated by Christians. There's the main issue is, was it really Samuel who appeared to Saul here? And that's something I can go into if you like. But one of the things that Augustine discusses is, could this mean that Saul was saved? Because some people look at this passage and they think, oh, this is nothing but a message of judgment here on Saul. So not only is he going to die, but in the afterlife he's going to be damned. But Augustine doesn't draw that as a firm conclusion. He said we will have to wait until the sermons are released later this year to see exactly what his reasoning is. But apparently he thinks along the lines of, well, wait, if it was Samuel, and if Samuel gave Saul this warning, then Saul might have repented, and so it's possible that Saul was saved. And so that's something that we don't have other early church fathers discussing. So this would be an item that is unique to Augustine as far as we can tell. Now, he seems not to have that as a firm conclusion here, but he raises it as a possibility, and it does go along with Augustine's belief that God can save anybody, even the worst sinner.
And that corresponds with how Augustine viewed the work of grace as well. But as you were mentioning earlier, there is a bit of a debate, if you will, amongst the fathers in interpreting this text as to whether it was really Samuel or a demon. But you make a compelling case for the biblical text itself. I invite you to shed light on that.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see what Augustine thought in these texts. Now, there have been two major schools of interpretation about this passage. One, the team demon interpretation, says it was not Samuel, it was a demon that was impersonating Samuel. The other interpretation, team Samuel, says no, by God's permission, it really was Samuel. And Augustine had shifting views on this. It seems that early in his career he was more on Team Demon, but by late in his career he was more on Team Samuel. One thing he didn't do was pronounce definitively on this, at least in the works we have available to us. So he was cautious and open-minded in how he approached it, and we'll have to wait till we can read the text to see where he is in his thought at this point in his career. But there are compelling reasons to be on Team Samuel. It's the natural reading of the text. There are no mentions of demons in this text at all, so you have to read those into the text. And the inspired author multiple times refers to the Spirit as Samuel, the inspired author also uses a factive verb, which is a kind of verb that indicates the author agrees that something is a fact. Like if I say, John knew that it was raining outside, I'm agreeing that it's a fact that it's raining. Whereas if I just said that John believed it was raining outside, I'm not asserting it as a fact that it was raining. Well, in this text, the inspired author says Saul knew that it was Samuel. So that factive verb tells us the author agrees it really was Samuel. And it wasn't just the author of 1 Samuel. The inspired author of the book of Sirach also agrees. And in Sirach, there's a passage that talks about how Samuel prophesied the king's death to him after Samuel himself was dead. So we've got another scriptural author also agreeing that it was Samuel. And Augustine found that passage in Sirach, and that's apparently one of the things that helped him revise his views on this question.
The press release that you highlight from the University of Würzburg, it seems to give us a bit of a window into how Augustine treats of this particular text. I wonder if you could share that.
Well, one of the things that is interesting about these two sermons is they form a pair. The first sermon was preached on a Sunday, and the second sermon was preached the following Wednesday. And what Augustine does in the first sermon is he says, this is a mysterious text, and it's hard to interpret, and so what I'm going to do for y'all today is I'm going to lay out the mystery and some of the different options about how you could interpret it. And so that's what he does in the first sermon. He doesn't come to any conclusions. He just lays out the options. And then he lets his readers think about it for the next several days. And then on Wednesday, he comes back and evaluates the options and comes to some tentative conclusions. And what's really interesting about that is he trusts his audience to think about a mysterious text. Instead of just dogmatically telling them this is what you should believe, he lets them weigh the options. He lets them form their own opinions about it and think about it. And he doesn't just come in and, insist that they read the book a certain way. And I really find that encouraging because I try in my own ministry, if people listen to me, for example, on Catholic Answers Live, they'll often hear me, because this is my regular practice, they'll hear me say, well, there's no church teaching about this, but there's this range of opinions, and I'll lay out all the different opinions, and then I may tell you, well, here's my opinion, but only in the context of letting you know about this broader range, and I let people think about the different options and draw their own conclusions rather than insisting on mine. And I find it very encouraging that St. Augustine took the same attitude with his audience all those years ago.
And like you rightly mentioned earlier, he has touched on this particular text in the past in writings that we do have. So what does this tell us about where these sermons sit in the trajectory of his career?
Well, unfortunately, it hasn't been announced so far as I've been able to determine when exactly he preached these sermons. It was obviously after he became the Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, but how early or late they were is something that hasn't been determined yet, at least not publicly. We'll have to wait until the text of the sermons come out and read what the scholars have been able to conclude about that matter. But the fact that he's so open on these questions suggests to me they may have been from his middle career, where he was not fully on Team Demon and he wasn't fully on Team Samuel. And to me, that suggests there's somewheres in the middle, but I would have to wait and see what they end up actually saying to be firm about that.
If you might pardon me to ask you to take a few steps back from the specificity of this conversation to Augustine's pastoral wisdom and the development of how he took prudential judgment issues or interpretive issues, can you share with us how that's very reflective of his evolving and growing pastoral heart and zeal as well as his intellectual acumen?
Well, he's clearly one of the smartest guys in church history. And, he's the major father from the West. And he and Aquinas have reputations as like the two great theologians from historical periods. And prudence is something that Augustine obviously valued after he became a Christian. He would acknowledge himself that he was a work in progress because he made some very imprudent decisions before he became a Christian. And then he found Christ and he committed his life to Christ. There's a famous conversion moment where he heard a child's voice saying, "Take and read," and he picked up a copy of Romans and read a passage that revolutionized his life. But even after he became a bishop, he continued to think about issues, and he's often very cautious in what he says. He's frequently not dogmatic. He'll on a lot of questions, he'll say there are these options, and this is the one I prefer, but he doesn't insist that everyone agree. But he also changed his views over the course of his career. He was humble enough that when he got new data, he would revise his views. And towards the end of his life, he wrote a work called Retractations, where he issued revisions to here's what I would say now, here's what I said back then, but here's what I would say now. And that willingness to revise your views and even do so publicly is something that shows real humility and intellectual engagement.
We're going to stop there. We've been talking to Jimmy Akin, Apologist of Catholic Answers. I'm Marcus Peter.